Hey cultists, it's Andy here, and in this video we're going to be painting some Lizardmen. These days I don't find myself playing many games, but actually the game I probably play the most at the moment is Warhammer Underworlds. And I think the reason for that is it's so accessible and quick and easy. I haven't finished painting my 40k army yet. I've attempted and failed a few. But I do have a nice Knothi warband that I've really enjoyed playing with, but now it's time for a new one. So I decided to go for the Starblood Stalkers. I thought this could be a great video for the channel, as you could use this to paint any kind of Lizardmen, and we're going to paint the entire warband, including the Chameleon in part 2, but we'll paint the Saurus Warrior and we'll paint the Skinks, and then you should be able to use that if you're painting this warband or if you're doing an entire army of these. Recently I've been painting lots of relatively dark and desaturated models with my Sons of Horus, and often I'm playing Underworlds on a not perfectly lit dining room table or whatever. So for this I wanted to do them really bright, really bold, and actually paint them in quite a nice simple way. I guess the main thing I want to show you in this is by starting with your brightest colour first as the base coat and then just gradually knocking it down, and that's kind of the technique I used for pretty much every surface on these figures. I started with some Wraithbone primer from Citadel, and you could use any light coloured primer. I really like these though, as they're super smooth. They're a lot less grainy than a pure white. Obviously they're designed for the contrast paints to go over nicely, but it's just a good primer, so Wraithbone or Grey Seer I really recommend. Here you can see me using the airbrush. You really don't need an airbrush for this tutorial, I'm just using it to base coat nice and smoothly. And like I said, I'm starting with my almost brightest colour, which is Scale 75 Caribbean Blue, which is an amazing turquoise, and hopefully you can see me spraying it on how nice a colour it is. And we're looking to get this perfectly opaque, but because it's going over that light primer, we're really getting a bright colour to start with, so I'm pretty sure this is going to show up nicely on the table. I then do some subtle shading. I'm spraying this from below, and this is with Aquatic Turquoise from AK. You could use something like Sotek Green from Citadel, and if you're just using the brush, then I would just layer it on all the muscles that kind of face downwards, almost like a wash, but only on the underside. This was so effective, I actually tried to make it a little bit darker, but I think this was a mistake. I used some ocean blue to shade it more, but it was a little bit too dark, so I ended up spraying Caribbean Blue again from above. If I was you, I would just do some Caribbean Blue and then a little bit of shading with the Aquatic Turquoise. Just need a subtle shade, I think. Now, to get some definition in the recesses on those scales, I'm going to give it an overall wash kind of glaze with the Aethermatic blue. I actually really like contrast paints in how they function, but the way I like to use them is instead of letting them do all the work how they're supposed to by, washing over the Wraithbone, I like to do it like this. So I do a very pale colour in the same tone, and then it's just using it like a traditional wash. It doesn't have to do as much work, and so I think it looks better. I'm trying not to let this flood in any area in particular, otherwise it looks a bit horrible. So it's like a careful wash all over, a little bit of a glaze, and it really does enhance the colour, as well as getting in all those cracks very easily for all those scales. So really nice way of doing it, and I really like using contrast paints for anything in this way. Paint a pale colour as opposed to the neutral colour, and get that contrast on there. I then blocked all of the scale areas in Ocean Blue from AK. I can use this fairly diluted, so it's like it's still a layer, but having it slightly diluted means you're kind of getting some of the definition and the cracks showing through. Later on in the process, I found this wasn't quite dark enough, so I tried using some of the Akhelian green contrast paint. This was a little bit too dark, so I ended up mixing Ocean Blue with this contrast paint, and that was perfect and flowed super nicely into this scaled area. I thought it would be a good idea to block everything in now with the basic colours, so I would make fewer mistakes later, hopefully. So every area that was going to be gold, I actually did with Rhinox hide. You might prefer to just go straight to the gold because it is time consuming doing an extra layer before, but I just prefer doing this way. All of the red areas I painted with wine red from AK. You could just use corn red, but I want a kind of cold crimson-y red for these areas. And there's some parts that are kind of a stone colour, so I used Reddish Grey from AK, but basically you want to just use a warm grey, so you could add some red to any grey or some brown, but we want to keep it a nice warm natural stone colour. I then started working on the metallic areas because I really hate getting metallics on parts that I've painted really well with normal acrylics, and I'm using Decayed Metal, cult favourite here, and this could definitely be your first base coat. So the Rhinox hide isn't necessary, but you know, anyway, get the Decayed Metal on there as your nice base coat for the metallics. I then used another favourite for me at the moment. I tend to do these things in phases, but at the moment I'm loving Peridot Alchemy from Scale 75, and the kind of greenish tone to it goes really nicely with the theme of these Lizardmen. I'm not looking to do anything flashy with the metallics. I just want to get them on really nicely, and I take my time just to do a nice opaque couple coats and let the metallics do all the work. Such a pretty colour, but I think if it's just sitting on there nicely, it will look great. I did some highlights with light bronze from Pro Acryl. This is a trickier than most paint to get hold of. I love it, but if you can't get hold of it, just add some silver to the Peridot Alchemy and it will look great. Just keeping it simple with some regular highlights and some nice edge highlights here. Yeah, nothing too crazy, like I said. With the metallics down, now I think we can move to the acrylic colours, and everything's kind of based so we can start doing the detail work and the highlighting. So I'll start with the main blue that we started with. We sprayed it Caribbean blue, but then we've washed it down, shaded it. So my first highlight is going to be with pure Caribbean blue again. I'm looking for nice, big, natural, soft highlights, as well as edge highlights on small details. And this should blend in very nicely because we've just shaded this colour a little bit. So just take your time with this step, as that is the main blue almost done after this. I was going to use a pastel blue to highlight this as it kind of made sense, but experimenting on the palette, I discovered pastel yellow produced a much more saturated and interesting colour, like a really bright green. So you can see here on the palette, I think that's a wonderful colour to highlight with. So just add a little bit of pastel yellow and it will change the colour quite dramatically. And I made 2 extra highlight tones with this. I was quite sparing with this highlight and I focused on focal areas such as the face and the arms and just the bits you're going to see on the table, really, the kind of upper areas, just to make those muscles stand out. And such a pretty colour that I really enjoyed adding these highlights. I started the darker scales on the back and I wanted these to be slightly more desaturated than the main blue, so we added pastel yellow to make it really bright. With these I added some grey, in this case medium grey, but any pale grey will do, and I added that to the ocean blue. So adding this grey makes it pale in colour, but not a bright, powerful blue. And I think it's important to get that balance of saturation. So I start by doing highlights on all the scales and little striations where it looks good. And I then added a little more of the medium grey and just hit up some of the corners and stuff like that. I think not a particularly bright edge highlight, but picking out all the edges can look really nice on these scales. Earlier we base coated the red parts with wine red, which is a fantastic dark crimson, and I decided to add some salmon or salmon rose from Vallejo to this, and this is definitely towards my taste. I love some magenta and pink, so if you want to do a more red, you go for it. But here I'm just picking out all of the sides of these scales that face upwards and the edges at the same time. I add a second stage of highlighting with a little bit more salmon added to it, and I'm just sparing with that on some of the top scales and the edges. And to finish this, I do a very diluted glaze of wine red, and this brings back the power and just, yeah, ties it all together very nicely. It's quite a translucent paint, wine red, so I found it worked really well for this part. I also did the tongues and other red elements at the same time, and it was really efficient doing it in this way. We're going to turn our attention now to the stone kind of elements, which actually are one of the things I think turned out the best. And I had to darken from my original base coat, and I added a bit of dark grey to the reddish grey. And I'm going to do lots of stippling and texture on this technique. So I'm back to the reddish grey now, and I kind of outline everything, which is a bit of a cartoony style I normally avoid. But I think with the way I'm going with these super bright, it will look cool. So I'm going to outline all of the armour on this, and then I just use the tip of the brush to quickly stipple. And I'm going to cover pretty much everywhere with this first one. I added some medium grey to the reddish grey. Again, any pale grey will do, but we're trying to switch from the warm grey base coat to a colder or more neutral grey here. So it starts with the reddish tone and ends with, yeah, like a much colder grey. And this little circular or sphere part is what I enjoyed the most. So remember how to highlight a sphere with a circular highlight, and we're going to stipple building that highlight towards the top there. And I really enjoyed doing this, and it turned out fantastic in the hand. Then I finished with some medium grey on its own, and I just continued to stipple and paint some little lines and scratches, and compared to the very smooth metallics, it was great having this super textured effect. And I finished on the helmet armour by painting some kind of veins, almost like marble. You know, you don't have to do this, but I think it looked kind of cool. The point is just have this area with heaps of texture, and it will contrast very nicely to the other elements. It's really starting to come together now, and this is something maybe I should have done earlier, but models are often made by the eyes, and these eyes are so big, and we're going to do them bright yellow so they can look really cool. So I block in all of the eyes with ice yellow to start with, so nice and pale, nice and opaque, and just get that really neat if you can. I then shaded the corners with Kimera warm yellow, but any warm yellow will do actually, and because you have the ice yellow, you won't have the coverage issues. I then re-highlighted this with cold yellow and finally the ice yellow again. You should have a really nice bright yellow doing it in this way, again starting from the palest colour, working your way down, and I'll just finish the eyes with a nice black dot, which was really fun to paint with this lizard eye, and then a nice white dot above that black part to make it shine. There are a couple leather elements which I kept super basic, and I just blocked these in with burnt umber from scale 75 and did a very sharp highlight with orange leather, a lovely orange to contrast the blue of course, and I did a few scratches and texture lines, but one base, one highlight, just do it really well. I think it's perfect for this. And while I've got the burnt umber out, I block in all the teeth and the horn elements so they're nice and dark. I did two highlights for this, nice and sharp. One was warm grey, kind of across all of the horns and stuff, and then I just did a nice shape dot with medium grey, just to make those claws look a little bit shiny. The tighter you can get this, the better it will look, but you can keep it simple if you paint it neat in this way. And to finish, we've got these feathers, and I thought let's do something nice and bright. They were yellow on the box art, and I thought, you know what, yellow is the one to go for. I started base coating with German yellow from Vallejo, and I shaded it with some desaturated colours like this brownish green, but in the end I changed my recipe to use these paints. So I would have base coated in the pastel yellow, it's just slightly nicer than the German yellow, but not much in it. Then shade this with some lime green, and this is a great colour. It's a very yellow green, so obviously it goes very nicely with this. And then I added a little bit of deep green to this lime green, so we get a contrast of temperature. So we're kind of shifting from a cold green, and it gets warmer as we get into the yellow. Now the key colour that I didn't use to start with was this Pistachio from AK, and I'm happy I get to use it just because it's called Pistachio, but fantastic colour. Just the right amount of green in, really powerful, and this was such a wonderful highlight. So I highlighted the tops of the yellow, and that kind of blended it into the green, and I did a final highlight where I added some pastel yellow to the pistachio, but you really don't need it. I would leave it nice and bold and let that pistachio shine through, blending into that lime green and then a little bit of deep green at the bottom. So nice and vibrant, lots of fun. I can't wait to see these on the table. So that is all the steps for these lizards. I hope you enjoyed it. I tried to make this video quite fast in terms of just going through some great recipes really, as opposed to getting bogged down into techniques. I think the main thing to take away, like I said at the start, is if you start bright, wash it down, and then neaten up with some highlights, you can get a fantastic result. And this is not new information or anything like that, but what I like to do is use those regular acrylic colours rather than the contrast paints the whole way through. But really fun way to paint. I really enjoyed it and it was rapid. I think you can get great results if you redo those highlights and you just take your time and do them sharp. That's the key for me. Get nice colours, nice and quick with the washes, but you don't need many highlights, but taking your time to get them neat and sharp made the models for me look really good. I was happy with the results on things like the scales, just because I managed to get them nice and neat even with 2 steps or whatever. I'm going to do another video for the chameleon. It'll be quite a quick one, but as it's a different recipe for the green, I didn't get it done for this one, and we'll go over the basing as well in that part. So we'll kind of finish all of these with the bases next time and that final chameleon model, and then we can see the warband finished. But hopefully you enjoyed this and you could use this for your Lizardmen. As always, comment below and let us know what you think of these recipes. If there's any colours that you like the look of, I really recommend Caribbean Blue and Pistachio. They were awesome to use, I loved those. And if you like our tutorial style but want to see more in-depth and advanced painting, then consider checking out our Patreon. Once again, hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon for a chameleon video.